lonely rancher, took in a girl from a broken home. What happened next in Wild West Stories? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Out on the wide western plains, where wind and dust speak louder than men, lived a rancher who kept one empty place at his table for something unnamed. Then one summer day, in the heat of the market, he reached out his hand to a girl with no home, and silence began to find its voice. A rancher lived his whole life in silence, yet always left one place at the table, for something he never dared to name. Late summer winds came rolling down off the ridges, brushing the valley with a dry hand. Dust clung to the porch rail, the window frame, the brim of a hat left hanging by the door. Jonas Hale woke before dawn the way he always did. He set water on the wood stove, listened to the faint rattle of the kettle, and poured coffee into a chipped enamel cup. The cabin held its silence. The spoon against the rim was the only sound, small enough to be swallowed whole by the quiet. Outside, leather reins hung from a rusty nail. The gray gelding raised its head when Jonas crossed the yard, half greeting, half habit. He laid a calloused palm against the animal's neck. No words passed. In this land, words were scarce as rain. He made his round slow, boots steady on the hard earth, checking hinges, latches, the sagging east fence. Wood warped but held, iron rusted but did not give. A man, too, could be like that. By noon, the sky pressed down hot as a skillet lid. Jonas pulled his hat low and tied a load of hay tight. He kept account of fence posts in his head. Better that than drifting back toward what was gone. In the kitchen, the chair across from his sat where it always had. Sometimes, without thinking, he set a second cup of coffee on the table. Then he'd put it away again, slow, like a man returning something to its rightful place. Nobody noticed. Nobody was there to notice. Toward evening, the light slanted through the cabin slats, gold on the dust. Jonas sat on the porch, a small knife shaping a scrap of wood into a handle for the shovel he meant to mend. Out past the fields, the windmill creaked steady as a pulse. Grass bent to the wind, birds marked the sky like flecks of ink. He glanced at the empty chair beside him, then looked away. The habit was old as the worn groove in the step, carved by years of one man walking in and out alone. On the bed inside, a hand-woven blanket lay folded tight. Beside it rested the one thing he kept from another life, a blue handkerchief, faded nearly to gray. He never unfolded it, didn't have to. Just knowing it was there was enough. On a shelf, a ledger waited, pages of rainfall tallies, calves born, hay stacked. In between the neat rows of numbers lay a stretch of empty space, left blank month after month. A space wide enough for another name, another reason, white as bone, sharp to the eye. Night pulled the plains flat and cold under a roof of stars. Jonas sometimes took out the old harmonica, breathed a tune with no title. Not sad, not glad, just thin as wind through reeds. The horse in the corral lifted its head, listening like it remembered. When he snuffed the lantern, he left it burning a little longer than needed, not for fear of the dark, but for the quiet hope of someone to come walking out of it. Then the flame sank, and the house returned to its deep stillness. The next day matched the one before, and would likely match the next. Jonas carried on, hammered a new nail in the sagging porch beam, braced a rail against the storm-bent fence. His shoulder cracked like brittle wood, but he kept moving. On the north line, a rabbit froze in dry grass, still as a thought that wouldn't finish. In the corner of the yard, a sage plant had outlasted summer, silvered leaves holding a faint, warm scent when crushed. Jonas lifted one leaf to his nose, remembered kitchens, laughter, voices long gone, and then set it back down as if returning a keepsake. From the gate, he could see the dirt road winding to town. It held wagon ruts, long, deep, but let go of footprints quickly. In rain, it glued you down. In heat, it cracked like an old palm. Dust would rise sometimes at the far bend, then settle again. Only wind after all. He carried a pocket watch whose spring caught and jerked before running on, much like his own heart, steady, plain, not quick to stir. He didn't ask much of life now. But most nights, before bolting the door, he'd lay an extra stick of wood by the stove. A habit, he told himself. Truth was, it was enough to warm more than one. A small wish, tucked beneath the dust and years, quiet as a seed waiting for rain. Folks in this country learned patience with such things. Lying awake, Jonas listened to the house breathe, the boards settling, the rafters shifting, the old bed springs sighing. Amid it all, he strained for another sound, the fall of footsteps on his porch. None came. Not tonight, maybe the next. He turned onto his side, drew the blanket up, and let the silence cover him. Out across the valley, the stars drifted slow. Inside, his heart kept its measure, slow, but not closed. A man could live a long time on plain water, dry bread, and hope never spoken. Amid the dust and jeers of the market, he found a girl with no home to return to, and his hand did not pass her by. The heat had not yet broken when Jonas loaded the wagon for town. The fields behind him lay brittle under the sun, stalks of grass rattling like bones. He set the reins and started down the dirt road, dust rising at every wheel turn. The valley seemed hollow with stillness, only the buzz of cicadas filling the air. By the time he reached the outskirts, shadows stretched long across clapboard buildings. The market street was quieter than usual, last of the season's trade winding down. A few men still bartered over feed, their voices thick with whiskey. Horses stomped against hitch posts, restless, eyes rolling white in the glare. Jonas guided his wagon slow, head tipped beneath the brim of his hat, saying little as always. He had no errands but hay and flour. Yet near the edge of the road, beside the old stage stop no coach had used in years, he saw her, a girl, slight in the shoulders, no more than 17. She sat folded on the steps, knees drawn under a thin blanket gone ragged. Hair hung across her face, tangled, dust-caked. Her shoes were gone, feet cut and hardened by gravel. Still she sat upright, eyes fixed on the line of hills beyond town, as if waiting for something that would not come. A pair of women passed and whispered, their voices clipped with judgment. Jonas caught fragments. Father sold the place, mother gone, child left behind. He didn't slow, but the words followed him as steady as the wheels. He pulled his wagon to a stop outside the feed store, yet found himself glancing back toward the stage stop. She hadn't moved. The air carried the smell of sun-baked leather, of iron dust from the blacksmith's shop. Jonas loaded his sacks in silence, paid the clerk with coins rubbed thin by use. When he came out, the sky was already bleeding toward dusk. The girl was still there. No one had stopped. No one had offered a word. Folks passed as though she were a shadow in their way. Jonas stood by his wagon, fingers resting on the wood rail. The road stretched open both ways, and he could have turned for home without a thought. But something about her stillness, too quiet for fear, too steady for begging, caught him. She didn't lift her hand, didn't call, only kept her gaze on the mountains. And in that gaze was the echo of a hunger he understood, though he had never named it for himself. He walked over at last, boots crunching the hard ground. The girl shifted, just enough to notice, but not to flinch. Dust gathered in the folds of her blanket. Jonas stood a moment, hat shadowing his face. Then he reached down and held out his hand. No speech, no promise, only the offer of steadiness. Her eyes rose slow, the faintest tremor passing through them, like a stone skipping across water. Then she placed her hand in his, rough from work beyond her years. Jonas helped her to her feet. He led her to the wagon. She climbed in without word, settling against the boards as though she had always known how to disappear inside silence. Jonas set the reins again. The horse stepped forward, hooves steady on the dirt road. Behind him, the girl leaned into the corner, blanket drawn tight. She never asked where he was taking her. He never said. The town lights thinned, the hills rose, and the road bent toward the ranch. Dust followed behind like a long shadow, and the night opened wide ahead. Under the same roof, two people sat in silence, each guarding a wound, separated only by a single breath. The wagon creaked into the yard just as the last rim of sun slid behind the ridge. The cabin stood plain against the dim sky, slanted roof, weathered boards, smoke curling thin from the chimney he had stoked before leaving. Jonas set the brake and stepped down. The girl followed without being asked, moving light, bare feet brushing dust from the step. She paused at the threshold, head bent slightly, as though uncertain if she belonged. Inside smelled of wood smoke and coffee gone stale. A single lamp burned on the table, its glow soft against rough-hewn walls. Jonas set his parcels aside, then nodded toward a chair. She sat, folding herself small, as if to take up as little space as possible. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, showing arms browned by sun, marked by work too heavy for her age. Jonas ladled stew from the kettle, thick with beans and salted pork. He placed a bowl in front of her, then one for himself. No words passed. She lifted the spoon slow, ate in silence, eyes lowered. Every scrape of metal against tin filled the room like thunder. Jonas chewed steady, keeping his gaze on the knot in the tabletop. He was used to silence. With her, though, it felt different, crowded, as if two solitudes had collided and did not yet know how to settle. When the meal ended, she gathered both bowls without asking and rinsed them at the basin. Water splashed against tin, soft and careful. Jonas leaned back in his chair, watching. She moved with a practiced quiet, the kind born from long years of keeping out of the way. When she finished, she stood near the hearth, hands folded before her, waiting as if for instruction. None came. He fetched a blanket from the chest and laid it on the small cot near the door. She stepped over, touched the wool as if testing whether it was truly hers, then lay down facing the wall. Jonas doused the lamp. Darkness settled heavy. From his own bed, he could hear her breathing, slow, shallow, like someone not yet convinced of safety. The next morning, he found her already awake. Fire stirred in the stove, coffee heating in the pot. She must have risen before dawn, as he did. She did not meet his eyes, but the cups were set on the table, two this time, waiting. Jonas sat, lifted his cup, and drank. The girl sipped hers in silence. Outside, the first light spread across the corral, touching the rails with gold. They spoke no words, not then, not through the day. She swept the floorboards, gathered eggs from the coop, moved with quiet purpose, as if the chores were her language. Jonas mended fence posts, sharpened tools, worked within sight of the house. Each time he passed the window, he caught a glimpse of her bent over some task, steady and deliberate. Yet when night came again, and the lamplight drew their shadows across the cabin walls, the distance remained. Two lives under one roof, bound by silence. Jonas had learned to live with emptiness. She had learned to hide within it. Now the question lingered in the air between them, whether that silence would keep them apart, or slowly, quietly, bind them together. When she knelt to bind a lame dog's leg, he saw himself in its eyes, broken but still standing. The days fell into rhythm, though not yet comfort. Jonas worked the fence lines, split wood, checked the creek bed for sign of coyotes. The girl, Clara, he had heard someone in town call her, kept to the house. She swept, tended the fire, moved through the rooms without stirring more than the sound of her own breath. They spoke little. It was easier to leave the silence untouched, like a surface of still water that might shatter if broken wrong. One evening, clouds had thickened low and the air smelled of dust. Jonas walked back from the far pasture, shoulders sore, hands stiff. As he neared the barn, he caught sight of her, crouched near the corner. A stray hound had limped into the yard, ribs showing, one hind leg drawn awkwardly against its belly. Most folks would have driven it off. Clara had not. She sat in the dirt, knees tucked under her skirt, coaxing the dog closer with nothing more than an open hand. The animal trembled, eyes wary, but it inched toward her as if some current passed between them. She did not speak. She only waited, hands still, patience steady as stone. At last, the hound pressed its muzzle against her palm, and she smoothed its ragged fur with slow strokes. Jonas stood in the barn doorway, watching. He had seen seasoned ranch hands, bitten bloody, for less. But the dog, broken as it was, allowed her touch. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and wound it gentle around the swollen leg. Each motion spoke of long practice and quiet care. Not pity, not fear, just a steady recognition of pain and an answer to it. Something in Jonas shifted as he watched. The way she bent over that lame creature reminded him of the way he lived, guarded, scarred, braced against every blow. He had spent years wrapping his own wounds in silence, binding them tight so no one would see. Now, here was this girl, broken in her own way, showing him what it meant to tend without question. When she lifted her head, she found him there. Their eyes met across the dusk. Neither spoke. She returned her gaze to the dog, stroking its side until its shiver eased. Jonas turned back toward the house, boots heavy in the dirt, but the picture stayed with him, the bent figure of a girl, the wounded animal leaning into her hand, and the knowledge, sharp and quiet, that he was no different from that hound. Later, in the kitchen, she set a cup of coffee in front of him without a word. He drank, staring into the dark surface. For the first time, the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt like a space where something might yet grow, fragile but real. She never spoke, only patched the roof and steadied the chair, and those small acts began to hold up his whole house. The weeks leaned deeper into autumn, and the nights carried a sharper edge. Jonas rose early, same as ever, but found the fire already stirred to life, a kettle warming. Clara moved like a shadow in the dim cabin, feeding the stove, setting 2 cups on the table before he had reached for the pot. She did not wait for thanks. She simply slid into her place, hands folded around her cup, as if she had always belonged at that table. At first, he thought little of it, but he began to notice changes. The porch rail, long loose from storms, had been braced with scrap wood. The old stool that rocked on one leg now sat steady, a sliver of pine wedged beneath. She gathered fallen kindling in her apron, stacked it neatly near the hearth. One afternoon, when Jonas returned from the north pasture, he found her kneeling on the porch roof, patching a gap with tar and shingles salvaged from the shed. The late light caught in her hair, and her hands moved sure, no hesitation. He did not ask her why. She offered no word, but little by little the house that had sagged under years of neglect stood straighter. The corners no longer wept when the wind pushed through. The floor gave fewer complaints beneath his boots. Jonas walked through the rooms and felt a quiet order where there had been only emptiness. That evening, he sat at the table longer than usual, watching the lamp burn low. Clara brought a plate of cornbread she had baked in the iron pan, set it down without ceremony, and took her seat across from him. She did not smile, but there was no fear in her eyes now, only a steady calm. They ate in silence, but the silence had softened, less like a wall and more like a quilt laid gently between them. When the meal was done, Jonas cleared his throat, an awkward sound in the small room. He fetched another spoon from the cupboard, set it beside her plate. It was a small gesture, almost nothing at all. Yet, when she glanced at it, then at him, there was a faint nod, as if she understood what he had meant, that the table was no longer meant for one. Later, as he lay in his bed, he listened to the creak of the rafters, the wind brushing against the walls, and beneath it, the faint sound of her breathing from the cot. For years, the house had held only his own measure of life. Now, there were 2 rhythms, side by side. It was not comfort yet, not trust, but it was enough to make the darkness feel less hollow. Jonas closed his eyes, the weight of the day heavy on his body. But his last thought before sleep was not of fences or cattle. It was of a patched roof, a braced rail, and a spoon set quietly on a wooden table, waiting for whoever might need it. The town's whispers cut into their quiet until he placed his old coat on her shoulders and said, "Here, you don't need to prove a thing." The trip to town came on a day when the wind blew restless, lifting skirts of dust across the valley road. Jonas needed salt, nails, a coil of rope. Clara rode in the wagon bed among the feed sacks, blanket tucked around her shoulders. She said nothing, but her eyes searched every rise of the hills as if memorizing them. At the market street, folks went about their business, trading eggs, tying off bundles of cloth, shouting prices that carried above the mule teams. Jonas hitched his mare and went inside the store, Clara trailing behind. Conversation slowed. He heard it in the hush of voices that picked up again too quick. in the sideways glances sliding her way. A pair of men near the counter leaned close, grins cut sharp as spurs. "Looks like Hale picked up strays, same as his cattle," one muttered, not low enough. Another spat into the sawdust. "Girl's got her daddy's blood. Won't be long before it shows." Laughter followed, coarse, short, the kind meant to bite. Jonas felt the weight of it, but gave no answer. His shoulders stiffened beneath his coat. He gathered his parcels, paid, and turned. Clara had already slipped outside, her face pale against the dust. On the ride home, she kept to herself, knees drawn close, blanket pulled higher. Her hands twisted in the fabric, though her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. Jonas drove on, jaw tight, the silence between them different now, tainted by words neither of them had spoken, but both had heard. At the ranch, she climbed down before he could offer a hand. She moved toward the porch, but stopped short, settling instead on the step. The evening light stretched long across the yard, painting her in muted gold. Jonas carried the parcels inside, then came back. She was still there, chin bent, eyes wet but stubbornly holding back. He stood for a long moment, hat in hand, dust gathering on his boots. Then, without flourish, he stepped behind her, unbuttoned his coat, and laid it over her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her slight frame, rough wool against her skin. She startled, then stilled. Jonas's voice came low, the first words he had given her all week. "You don't need to prove yourself here." That was all. He left it there, plain and steady, and walked back inside. She sat unmoving on the step, fingers clutching the edges of his coat. For the first time since the road from town, her breath evened. When the night deepened, she carried the coat with her to the cot, not folded neatly but draped over her like a shield. Jonas lay awake longer than usual, listening to the sound of the wind push at the shutters. The silence of the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like something fragile, worth guarding. On the doorframe, she scrawled one word, "Cold," and that was how he knew he was no longer alone. The first frost came quiet, a pale shimmer across the pasture grass. Jonas woke to see his breath cloud in the lantern light. When he stepped into the kitchen, the stove was already lit, fire crackling soft, and 2 cups waited on the table. Clara sat in her usual place, hair tied back, eyes lowered. She sipped slow, both hands cradling the tin cup as if to warm more than her fingers. It was later that day, after mending fence posts along the south line, that Jonas noticed the first sign. By the doorframe, where the wood bore decades of knife scratches and nail holes, a piece of charcoal had scrawled 3 words, "Wind changes soon." No name, no explanation, just that. He rubbed the mark with his thumb. The black came off faint, smudging into his skin. He said nothing of it, but the next morning, another note appeared. Small, crooked letters, pressed into a scrap of board, "Woodlow." She had left it on the table beside his ledger. Later still, another line near the stove, "Hen limps." Her writing was spare, direct, but each word carried weight. They were not requests, they were offerings, little bridges across the silence. Jonas began to look for them the way a man might look for weather signs, a new leaf, a shift in the clouds. And when he found one, he carried it in his pocket longer than needed, as if the wood or scrap of paper held more warmth than the fire itself. One evening, returning from the far pasture, he found her at the window, charcoal in hand. She drew slow, careful, as though the board itself might resist. When she stepped back, a single word waited there, "Cold." Then she turned, met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not just silence in her eyes, but an intent to be heard. Jonas nodded once. That night he set extra wood by the hearth. When the wind rose after dark, rattling the eaves, the cabin stayed warm. Clara sat close to the fire, needle in hand, mending a tear in his work shirt with stitches, small and even. She did not speak, but when he glanced her way, she lifted her eyes a moment, steady, quiet, enough. The silence between them had changed. It no longer pressed like a wall. It moved like a current carrying fragments from one to the other, needing no voice. Jonas found himself listening for it, as if silence itself had become a language worth learning. And as winter pressed closer, he began to realize it was not the roof she had mended or the stool she had braced that shifted the house. It was these small marks, these whispered notes scratched onto wood and paper, that turned emptiness into a kind of belonging. When lightning crushed the barn roof, he understood. She did not hear with ears, but with her whole soul. The storm came sudden, the way storms do on high country. All afternoon the air had worn a false calm, sky stretched pale and open, the cattle grazing easy in the lower field. Jonas felt only a prickle at the back of his neck, but Clara moved different, restless, her eyes to the ridge, her hands twitching like she was listening to something beneath the ground. Near dusk, as Jonas was hauling tools into the shed, she appeared at the doorway, hair blown loose, feet bare on the dirt. She tugged his sleeve hard enough to jolt him. Her eyes, wide and sure, cut toward the barn. Jonas hesitated, a question half formed, but before it left his lips, the air split with light. The crack of lightning came down behind the cattle shed, bright enough to blind, loud enough to shake dust from the rafters. The blast tore through the old oak tree, splintering it to fire. Jonas stumbled back, ears ringing, the calves bald, hooves pounding against the rails. Clara did not freeze. She moved fast into the barn, voice still absent, but gestures sharp, urgent. She slapped a rope into his hands, pushed at the first gate. Jonas caught her meaning at once. They drove the horses out, the gelding screaming against the thunder. The mare reared, eyes rolling, but Clara's palm touched its flank, steady, deliberate. Against all sense, the horse dropped back to earth and followed her lead into the rain. Then came the sound of timber giving way. Jonas turned as the north beam groaned, split, and fell. The barn roof sagged, then buckled with a roar, crashing down into the place they had stood moments before. Smoke and dust rose with the rain, choking the air. Jonas coughed hard, blinking grit from his eyes. Clara stood at his side, soaked through, chest heaving, but steady. She did not flinch at the wreckage. Her gaze was fixed on him. "How did you know?" he managed, his voice rough against the storm. She did not answer. She only touched her chest with her palm, then lifted her hand toward the sky, rain streaming between her fingers. It was not explanation. It was only certainty. That night, after the last animals were sheltered and the fire banked low in the cabin, Jonas sat at the table, shoulders sagging, hands raw. Clara moved quietly, laying a blanket over his shoulders. She set no chalk, wrote no word. She only sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes steady on the flames. Jonas looked at her and saw not a girl dragged out of a broken life, but a spirit tuned to the land in ways he would never grasp. He had lived years listening to silence and hearing nothing. She had lived years without a voice, and yet had heard everything. The storm rattled the shutters. Sparks hissed in the hearth. Between them stretched a silence so deep it no longer felt empty. It felt earned. It felt shared. Each morning she wrote, "Today will be kind," and he believed, just as he believed the land would bloom again after the storm. Winter laid itself slow across the valley, not with violence, but with the weight of time. Frost laced the fence posts, the fields turned pale under thin snow, and the cattle huddled closer each night. The cabin, once hollow as a drum, now carried two rhythms of life. Jonas's heavy boots across the floorboards, Clara's lighter steps following after. She kept a small slate near the door, chalk worn short. Each morning she wrote a single line. "Cold will bite today," or "Chicken's restless." Sometimes just "Be still." Jonas read them like prayers, simple words that somehow reached further than speech. He found himself listening to her silence as he once listened to the windmill creak, steady and enduring. In the evenings, she sat by the hearth, stitching scraps of cloth into something whole, patches of wool, faded cotton, even a strip from his old shirt. Jonas watched her hands moving, slow and sure. It struck him that she was not only sewing fabric, but mending a house, a life, a man who had long thought himself beyond repair. One night, he poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the table. The lamp burned low. Clara wrapped her fingers around the cup, not drinking, just warming her hands. After a moment, she set it down and reached across, resting her palm against the back of his weathered knuckles. No smile, no word, only the weight of her touch, light but certain. Jonas turned his hand, curled his fingers over hers. The silence thickened, yet it did not press, it held. Outside, the wind shifted snow against the walls, but within those walls there was warmth enough. As days turned longer, they worked side by side. She planted a line of herbs by the porch, their green a promise against the pale ground. He built a bench beneath the cottonwood, its boards sanded smooth, meant for two. Sometimes, when chores were done, they sat there shoulder to shoulder, saying nothing, watching the sun lower behind the hills. The neighbors still talked, some with pity, some with suspicion. Jonas let their voices pass like dust, for in the quiet of his home he had found what words could not buy nor break. Another heartbeat in the room, another pair of hands steady as the land itself. And Clara, who once had no place to go, now rose each morning and wrote on the slate, "Today will be kind." Jonas never asked how she knew. He only believed her. So the ranch stood, weathered, scarred, but no longer lonely. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was full, the way a held breath is full, waiting not for sound, but for meaning. And in that quiet, two lives, once broken in separate ways, had found a rhythm together, plain, steady, and enough. Out on the plains, where the wind carries both dust and memory, not every story ends with thunder or triumph. Some simply settle, like snow across a pasture, soft and steady. Jonas and Clara never spoke much. Truth is, they didn't need to. What they shared was quieter than words, but strong enough to outlast the storms. And maybe that's what healing looks like here in the West. Not a grand gesture, not a loud redemption, but two people finding they can sit at the same table, mend the same roof, and carry the same silence without fear. If you've ever known a silence that felt like home, or found kindness in a place you didn't expect, I'd like to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, not for noise, but so another soul might read it and feel a little less alone under their own wide sky. Because out here, the quiet has a voice, and sometimes it speaks through you.